There's a lot of evidence that supports the theory that the so-called lost 10 tribes of Israel ended up in Europe and that they today make up the core of the nations of northwestern Europe and their daughter nations around the world. But what about DNA studies and genetics? Do they support this theory? In this video, we will show that DNA studies neither proves nor disproves this theory. But before looking into the details, we must also remember that DNA studies does not prove the Bible's narrative that all men and women are descended from Adam and Eve. Because according to the Bible, Adam and Eve were created approximately 6,000 years ago, and all living men and women descend from Adam and Eve. But according to DNA studies and geneticists, all men and women descend from a so-called genetic Adam who lived approximately 100,000 years ago in Africa, and a so-called genetic Eve who also lived in Africa but approximately 200,000 years ago. What the Bible says and what geneticists say at this present time are obviously two very different things. So obviously one of them must either be wrong or perhaps they don't have a full picture. They don't know everything there is to know about DNA and genetics yet. And since we as Christians know that the Bible is the Word of God and that the Bible is true, it must be the geneticists who either are wrong or don't know everything there is to know yet about DNA studies. And of course, studying science is good for a lot of things, and we should do it, but we should not put blind faith in it. So before starting this study, let us read what Paul wrote to Timothy in the first epistle to Timothy, chapter 6. O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science falsely so called. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 20. And by the way, if you want to read more about DNA and the lost 10 tribes of Israel and a lot of other things about the lost tribes of Israel, you can buy my book, The Lost 10 Tribes of Israel in Europe. You can buy it on Amazon, and the price excluding postage and handling is $9 for the paperback version and $17 for the hardcover version, this one. And you can also buy it for $2 in Kindle as a Kindle ebook. Why DNA haplogroups? The Y chromosome is a male chromosome. A father passes on his Y chromosome to his sons, but not to his daughters. But you can detect it in the daughter, but the daughter herself does not pass it on to her offspring. A man's particular version of the Y chromosome is called a Y-DNA haplogroup. Since most families have both sons and daughters, it is statistically probable that even though most fathers will have many descendants, their unique Y-DNA will vanish, because the Y-DNA haplogroup is only inherited through the male-to-male line. It is not an average of a man's forefathers' Y-DNA haplogroups, so it's not an average of all the haplogroups that a man's forefathers had, as an article in the magazine Nature explains. Quote, when the overall population size does not change, as is likely to have happened for long periods of human history, men have, on average, just one son. In this case, evolutionary theory predicts that for any given man there is a high probability that his paternal line will eventually come to an end. All of his male descendants will then have inherited Y chromosomes from other men. In fact, it is highly probable that at some point in the past, all men except one possessed Y chromosomes that by now are extinct. All men living now then would have a Y chromosome descended from that one man identified as Y chromosome Adam. The biblical reference is a bit of a misnomer because this Adam was by no means the only man alive at his time. Unquote from Nature magazine. So this means that a white-skinned man who has 63 white male-skinned ancestors with an Israelite Y DNA haplogroup and only one black-skinned male ancestor who has a black African Y DNA haplogroup will have a black African Y DNA haplogroup if the black African ancestor is the direct male ancestor. This means that Y DNA haplogroups are good for detecting close relationships, but that they cannot tell where most of a person's ancestors came from, and much less from where the ancestors of an entire population came from. This was essentially what the British geneticist Adam Rutherford wrote in Scientific American in 2018. We quote, "Genetics is a probabilistic science, and there are no genes for anything in particular. When it comes to ancestry, DNA is very good at determining close family relations, such as siblings or parents, and dozens of stories are emerging that reunite or identify lost close family members or indeed criminals. For deeper family roots, these tests do not really tell you where your ancestors came from." Unquote. Adam Rutherford's article was entitled "How Accurate Are Online DNA Tests?" and he concluded that the popular DNA tests that claim to show where a person's ancestry is from are basically useless. We again quote from his article. They say, "Where DNA like yours can be found on Earth today, by inference, we are to assume that significant proportions of our deep family came from those places. But to say that you are 20% Irish, 4% Native American, or 12% Scandinavian is fun, trivial, and has very little scientific meaning. We all have thousands of ancestors, and our family trees become matted webs as we go back in time, which means that before long our ancestors become everyone's ancestors. Humankind is fascinatingly closely related, and DNA will tell you little about your culture, history, and identity." Unquote. Jewish and Arab Y DNA haplogroups. The patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of course, had a particular Y DNA haplogroup, but we do not know which. But an educated guess would be haplogroup J, because approximately 40% of Jewish men belong to haplogroup J. Abraham was the father of Isaac and Ishmael, who is believed to be the ancestor of the Arabs. Ishmael and his direct male descendants would therefore have the same haplogroup as Isaac and Jacob and their direct male ancestors. Haplogroup J, as we see on this map, is even more common among Arabs on the Arabian Peninsula, which is the Arab homeland from where the Arabs spread out over the Middle East and North Africa during the advent of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries. For example, Saudi Arabia is 57% haplogroup J, and Qatar is 67%, and the United Arab Emirates is 45%, and Yemen is 82% haplogroup J. Arab genetics therefore confirm the assumption that haplogroup J could be the original Israelite haplogroup. For various reasons, archaeologists have almost no skeletons of ancient Israelites they can test for DNA. But in 2023, a family tomb was discovered in Kiryat Yearim, 15 kilometers west of Jerusalem in Israel. The tomb is believed to be from approximately 750 to 650 BC. Geneticists were able to take a DNA sample from just one man, and he belonged to haplogroup J2. Just one sample is, of course, not enough to prove anything, but it does indicate that haplogroup J was a dominant haplogroup among the ancient Israelites. If we assume that most of the ancient Israelite men belong to Y DNA haplogroup J, most males of the lost 10 tribes would probably also have been of Y DNA haplogroup J. But the peoples of northwestern Europe have only a small amount of haplogroup J. They belong primarily to Y DNA haplogroup R, which is connected with the spread of the Indo-European languages, and to a smaller extent to haplogroup I, which is rather closely related to haplogroup J. How can this be explained? My hypothesis about missing DNA links. Throughout world history, it has been very common that two ethnic groups mix, and when they mix, the dominant group contributes most of the male Y DNA, and the subordinate group contributes most of the female MT DNA. Two examples of this are Iceland, which on the surface is a Nordic country. Most of its male Y DNA is from Norway, but most of its female MT DNA is from the British Isles. And the second example is Colombia in South America, and the ancestry of the Colombians is made up primarily of Spanish and West African male Y DNA and Native American female MT DNA. Iceland is therefore also a Celtic nation, but you would not know it if it was not for DNA studies, because they speak a Nordic language and have a Nordic culture. It is more obvious that Colombia is a Spanish, Native American, African nation, because it is easy to see the physical difference between these three ethnic groups. Something similar might have happened to the lost 10 tribes. When the 10 tribes of Israel were deported by the Assyrians and settled in northern areas of the Assyrian Empire, the 10 tribes had nothing. They were a defeated enemy which had been forced to walk on foot hundreds of kilometers. When they settled down in northern Assyria, they must have been at the bottom of the social ladder. They must have been much poorer than their neighbors which had lived there for centuries or millennia. Now, it is a part of human nature that males, do not mind marrying women of a lower social standing as long as they are physically attractive and can bear them children. Women, on the other hand, are more selective in their choice of a male partner because they want their children to be better off than themselves. This is true today, and it was even more true in the past. When the 10 tribes settled in northern Assyria, and in the first couple of generations after their deportation, many Israelite families must be assumed to have married their daughters to their non-Israelite neighbors' sons. The sons of the Israelite families must, on the other hand, have had a hard time finding a partner because many of the Israelite daughters were given in marriage to non-Israelite men. This would have meant that the descendants of the 10 tribes of the Israelites continued to multiply, although many of them were of mixed ancestry and belonged to other ethnic groups. This would also have meant that the Israelite male Y DNA haplogroup J became more and more rare. When Israel entered a covenant with the God of Israel, they chose to stay separate from the other nations. But the 10 tribes had continued to worship pagan gods, and that was the very reason why they were deported. When the 10 tribes settled in northern Assyria, most of them were therefore just as pagan as their new neighbors, and would have had no objections intermarrying with their new fellow pagans. The fact that the 10 tribes were poor and in a state of submission compared to their neighbors could explain why the presumed Israelite Y DNA haplogroup J died out among the descendants of the 10 tribes. That, and the fact that the 10 tribes were pagans just like their new neighbors, could also explain why the Hebrew language died out among them. They intermarried with other ethnic groups, and these ethnic groups became partly Israelite. The deported 10 tribes were placed in a number of different areas in Assyria. They were therefore few and far between, and they were all very poor and without means. This meant that in order to survive, they had to learn the language of their neighbors. In the first couple of generations, the Hebrew language probably survived, but after a couple of generations, the Hebrew language must have become optional and unnecessary because the descendants of the 10 tribes had to know at least one other language in order to survive and thrive. so why speak Hebrew? A language which would not bring you any material profit. The poor and downtrodden state of the 10 tribes in the beginning of their exile could explain both why the presumed Israelite male Y-DNA haplogroup J vanished among the descendants of the 10 tribes. It could also explain why the Hebrew language and the knowledge of the Israelite ancestry was lost. The 10 tribes of Israel did survive their exile, but probably more through the descendants of the Israelite women than through the descendants of the Israelite men. Female mtDNA haplogroups. mtDNA is traced through the female line only from mother to daughter, just like Y-DNA is traced through the male line only. Looking for the female mtDNA of the ancient Israelite women would be much more difficult than looking for the male Y-DNA of the Israelite men, because the 12 patriarchs were born of 4 different mothers, and the 12 patriarchs married women of various ethnic groups, who most likely had different mtDNA haplogroups. As you can see from this illustration, Y-DNA haplogroups are inherited through the male line only, and mtDNA haplogroups is inherited through the female line only, but then there's also a third called autosomal DNA, which is inherited from all of your ancestors. But this autosomal DNA is extremely unreliable, so geneticists generally put very little trust in that one. Alternative hypothesis number 1 about missing DNA links. The British Israel World Federation set up a group led by Martin Lightfoot to investigate the genetic connection between the ancient Israelites and the lost tribes. They did not come to a definitive conclusion, but Martin Lightfoot wrote that Y-DNA haplogroup R1b likely is the Israelite male haplogroup. The Y-DNA haplogroup R is by most mainstream geneticists associated with the spread of the Indo-European languages. Haplogroup R is also the dominant haplogroup in almost all of Europe, Russia, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, which all are areas where Indo-European languages are spoken today. The Proto-Indo-Europeans were not Israelites, but the 10 tribes did intermarry with Indo-European peoples. Haplogroup R can therefore be associated both with the non-Israelite Indo-Europeans and with the ethnic groups which spoke an Indo-European language but were of mixed Israelite and Indo-European ancestry. The specific haplogroup R1b came from the Middle East to Europe. R1b is by far the most common haplogroup in Western Europe. It is also the most common among Armenians, whose variant is earlier than the one in Western Europeans, which means that the Western European carriers of R1b must have left Armenia in the distant past, which was exactly what the lost 10 tribes did. Haplogroup R1b also shows how much coincidence plays a role in the spread of haplogroups, and why the study of haplogroups should not be relied on too much when studying the migrations of peoples. The places where R1b are common are number 1, Western Europe, and especially among the Irish and the Basques, and number 2, among Armenians and other places in the Middle East, and number 3, among a large number of black African people in Cameroon, Chad, Nigeria, and Sudan, and number 4, among the Turkic-speaking Bashkir people on the eastern slopes of the Ural Mountains in Russia. So what is the link between these very diverse ethnic groups beside R1b? None, besides coincidence. These very diverse people are obviously not all of one people or of one origin. So what must have happened is that men with R1b haplogroup must have migrated and gotten into positions of power, and thereby have been able to beget many sons who also had the R1b haplogroup. Alternative hypothesis number 2 about the missing DNA links. Yair Davidi is the author of many books about the lost tribes of Israel, which he also traces to Europe. And Yair Davidi writes that DNA studies do not support our view of the lost tribes, but he suggests that it could be because of environmental influences on the DNA which are not generally acknowledged or have yet to be discovered. This could also be true. Things that are missing are either not yet discovered or they do not exist. For a long time, atheists and Bible critics, for example, ridiculed Christians by claiming that the stories about King David were fictional fairy tales, because he was only mentioned in the Bible and no archaeological finds mentioned him. But then in 1993, a stone slab, a stela, was found in Tel Dan in northern Israel, which mentioned, quote-unquote, the house of David. And suddenly there was archaeological proof of King David's existence. And something similar could be true when it comes to the genetic links between the ancient Israelites and the lost tribes. DNA conclusions. The patriarch Joseph, who was sold to slavery in Egypt, is a type of the house of Joseph, which was deported out into the nations of the world. When Joseph came to Egypt, he married an Egyptian woman. When his brothers met him, they thought he was an Egyptian, and when his bones were buried in the land of Canaan, the Canaanites thought it was Egyptians who buried his bones. In other words, after Joseph came to Egypt and achieved greatness, he seemed more like an Egyptian than a Hebrew. This is probably also true when it comes to DNA haplogroups. After the lost tribes were deported, they probably lost not only the Hebrew language and their Israelite identity, but also most of the Israelite Y-DNA haplogroups. When people millennia afterwards would look for them, they would still be lost. If they had kept the Hebrew language, the religion of the God of Israel, the Israelite identity, and the Israelite Y-DNA haplogroup, they would have been recognized by the people of the world as the lost 10 tribes of Israel. But the lost tribes are not going to be generally recognized as the lost 10 tribes of Israel until the second coming of the Messiah. We are uncovering a mystery which God has intentionally hid from the peoples of the world. We can therefore conclude that sometimes the study of DNA and genetics can tell us about the ancestry of an ethnic group, but sometimes it can tell us nothing or little about the ancestry of that ethnic group. And the reason is that sometimes when one ethnic group mixes with another ethnic group, the Y-DNA of, for example, ethnic group number 2 becomes dominant in ethnic group number 1, even though most of the ancestry in ethnic group number 1 is still the original ancestry from ethnic group number 1. Still, you can only detect the direct male line, the male ancestry, which happens to be from ethnic group number 1. So in other words, trying to trace the ancestry of a modern ethnic group, it is basically like flipping a coin. Sometimes you get the right answer and sometimes you get the wrong answer. That is, if you put a blind faith in DNA studies, which we should not do. And we can also conclude that the lost 10 tribes of Israel indeed did migrate to Europe, and that they do make up the core of the nations of northwestern Europe and their daughter nations around the world. And that the reason why most of the descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel today carry the male Y-DNA haplogroup R1 is because the 10 tribes intermixed with the Indo-European speaking tribes, and that they picked up the Indo-European R1b haplogroup, and that haplogroup became the predominant among the descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel.